We had a great question come in this week about how do you strike a balance between growing your podcast audience, but also increasing conversions from your podcast at the same time? Is it possible to do both, or do you need to focus on one over the other at different points in your podcasting journey? And in this episode, we're going to unpack what you need to do if you want to grow your listener base and increase conversions from listeners to leads. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy.
Hi, Courtney. This is Philip Pape from the Wits and Weights podcast, and I've been thinking about the balance between audience growth and sales conversion in podcasting because I've focused a lot on growth and I've done okay. I've done pretty well in growing over the past year or so, but I think that the conversion side probably needs the focus right now. And it seems like these two goals can sometimes pull in different directions. And I've heard you say that, how-to content might be great for attracting new listeners, but not so hot for driving sales. And on the flip side, perspective shifting content could be better for conversions. So I'm wondering, should we be tackling these goals separately, or is there a way to make them work together? Is it possible to create content that both grows your audience and boosts sales? Or like in my space with periodizing your nutrition, do we go through fat loss at one point and then building muscle at another? And we kind of go back and forth, sort of enhancing each other, but focusing on them independently. I'd love to hear your take on this. How do you navigate the balance in your own podcasting strategy?
So Philip, this is a common problem. And I want you to know that you're not alone with this, because what happens is for most people, when they launch their podcast, once they get that podcast out there, it's up, it's running, they're publishing episodes every week, their brain immediately shifts to growth mode. I call it growth mode. And this is where you get so focused on growing your podcast, growing your audience, because there's a part of you that believes the conversions will naturally happen when your audience grows. And usually that's not the case. And in a moment, I'll explain why. But if you're listening right now, I guarantee that if you have been focusing on the growth of your podcast, you probably publish an episode or more every week without fail. I know you have the best mic that you can afford. I know you have your editing process dialed in. You're putting out a quality product. Chances are you've had some big name guests on your show. You've been guesting on other podcasts. You might have even been running ads, kind of like the ones we talked about back in episode 259. And you've also probably been giving calls to actions on your episodes. Maybe not all of your episodes, but on enough of your episodes that you would think some listeners would have taken action by now. And chances are you've probably seen some growth to your podcast, to your overall download numbers, to your listener base. But you're not converting as many listeners to leads and to clients and customers. So if you're listening and this is you, let's talk about why this happens. The first and the biggest reason is because podcast growth and podcast conversions are mutually exclusive. So what this means is that they are two independent functions that should function together, but that don't automatically function together. So just because you grow one doesn't automatically mean that the other is going to grow. And what happens is most people lump these together and they assume, well, a bigger audience equals more sales. And this is not just true with podcasting. Let's be honest. This is kind of true with the entirety of our businesses. If you're a business owner, if you're a coach, a consultant, an online business owner, and if you have any sort of program or promise that you deliver to people, whether that be through a course or group coaching, however you deliver it, we have all been conditioned and indoctrinated even to believe that a bigger audience means more money, more growth, more sales. That's how you scale, right? We got to grow. And there's some truth in that. But if the audience you have right now isn't buying, what causes you to think that a bigger one will? Years ago, when I first started my podcast, I was only a few years into my business at the time, and I still hadn't hit six figures. And between you and me, starting my podcast was a last-ditch effort for me to grow my audience and to make some money. I had given myself a 5-year goal, and I was like, if I don't hit six figures by 5 years in, then I'm out. And at the time, I believed that if I wanted more sales, I needed a bigger audience. But the problem was I never stopped to question why my current audience wasn't buying in the first place. And this was a big mistake. So I was doing all the same things. I was publishing episodes every week. I was getting big guests on my show. I'd get so excited when a big guest would be like, yes. I'm like, really? You want to come on my show? Little bitty old me? And it was like such a big boost to the ego. But in the long run, it didn't actually do anything to bring me more clients and customers. So I'm like, okay, well, I need to get the podcast in front of more people. So I'm guesting on other podcasts. I'm sharing the show everywhere, social media, all the things. And the podcast did grow, but the sales didn't. And what I learned from that is two things. Number one, there are two types of traffic when it comes to podcasting. There's driving traffic to your show to grow your podcast audience, your listener base. And then there's driving traffic from that show to grow your inner circle of people who are most likely to buy from you. That's number one. Number two is I learned the hard way that just because your podcast audience grows doesn't mean that that same audience is going to convert. So what does this mean for us as podcast hosts? And in my work over the years, I have found that there are several reasons why hosts struggle to convert listeners to leads from their podcast. Two of the biggest reasons are because they don't have a marketing or sales funnel built around the podcast. They're expecting the podcast to do all of the heavy lifting, but they haven't actually built the funnel from cold listener to finding the show, to warming up and actually getting excited and wanting to take the next step to work with you, to ultimately the point of sale. So they've got some missing pieces in the funnel around the podcast. But the other piece of it is they're actually doing a disservice to their listeners by equipping them with way too much information on the podcast itself, which can leave listeners feeling either overwhelmed because they think, oh my gosh, now I have to go do all of these things, or I want to do all of these things that you're telling me I need to do before I'll be ready to join your program. And we have definitely had this happen to us. Or on the flip side, they feel like, well, thanks. Now you've just given me everything that I need, so I don't need your program. See ya. And so this is why I love this question, Philip, of should we be tackling these goals separately, or is there a way to make them work together, growing the show and converting leads from it? Because what this question shows me is that you're someone who values leverage, and so do I. So I want you to think of it like this. Think of these two types of traffic, growing the show, increasing conversions, as separate goals, but a unified strategy. And growth and conversion, sometimes they can seem like a tug of war, like they're opposing, right? Which one do I focus on? But they can and they should work together. Think of them as two parts of a cycle that feed into each other, or two tires to a bicycle to get you where you want to go, whatever metaphor you like best. So the ultimate goal here is that they do work together so that as the podcast grows, so will your conversions. In fact, this is what phase 3 of our program Pod Launch is all about, which is understanding how to optimize the flow of traffic to your podcast so you can build that strong foundation for audience growth, and then building the marketing funnel around your podcast so you can scale your growth and turn your show into not just a reliable source of leads, but also a reliable source of income. Because as podcast hosts, we all want more growth. And it sounds like you've done a pretty good job of that, Philip. So what I'm going to focus on for the remainder of this episode is the other side of that coin, the conversion piece. So without stopping what you're doing on the growth side, you also want to begin building a funnel around your podcast to funnel leads from your show into your programs and offers. Now, there's a lot of nuances to this process, but the first step is to simply just reverse engineer the process. We want to begin with the end in mind. And the question here to ask yourself is, how many leads per month do you want from your show? It amazes me when I ask podcast hosts this, they'll tell me, well, I never actually thought about that before. And I'm like, wait a minute, you started this podcast to get leads and sales to your business, and you've never thought about how many leads per month that you want from your show? Let's do some math. Let's figure that number out. And for some of them, it actually winds up being a lower number than they thought it needed to be. I'll never forget the time I was on a call with a client and we ran the numbers and she's like, well, really, I only need 2 leads per month from my show to help me meet the KPIs that she was working on right then. And I'm like, really, that's it? 2 leads? She's like, yeah, 2 leads. And she felt so encouraged by that because she was like, it's only 2 people. Surely I can get 2 people a month from my show. So that's a question you have to answer first. The other question you have to ask yourself is, how will I know when I've gotten a new lead? When will I count them as a lead? Is it when they fill out an application? Is it when they book a call? Is it when they get on your email list? There's no right or wrong answer. You just want to pick the one that makes the most sense for you because we want to optimize the funnel for that. So then once you've got the answers to those questions, then we can identify key metrics to start tracking the conversions from the podcast. So the way that we do this internally is we will plan quarterly goals for the show, and then we will track that on a monthly basis. And we get into the nitty-gritty of the numbers. In fact, we just had a meeting this week digging deep into all the data of all the podcasts and all the episodes and which ones are most popular and which ones have the most retention and so on and so forth. And we look at that both to make tweaks to our strategy as we go so we can hit those goals, but also to make informed decisions about the podcast in real time. So then once you've got that in place, then we want to take a look at the listener journey from podcast to purchase. And the less hoops that you can make a listener jump through, the better. So here on this show, if you've listened for any length of time, you know that I tend to give 2 calls to action. It's either to our live workshop, which typically takes place about once a month, or I just say, if you want XYZ, go book a call, go to the show notes. Like, let's talk. Let's see if you're a fit for pod launch. Because what that does is it actually eliminates a step for our listener. If you're listening and you're plugged in and you're engaged to this podcast every single week, you don't necessarily have to go to the workshop. You're welcome to come to the workshop. I would love to hang out with you on the workshop. But if you were like, I'm just ready to take the next step, well, then I want to make that next step available to you. The beautiful thing is that with either of these steps for us, you also get on our email list. And that is how we internally as a company count a new lead. It's when someone raises their hand and goes from passive listener to actively engaged member of your audience. And for us, it's, I want to be subscribed to what you're doing because I want more. I want to learn more. So again, there's no right or wrong as to how you count that new lead, but you've got to be able to decide how you're counting them so that you know how to track them, because it's going to inform all the rest of your metrics and all the rest of your numbers. And then from there, just to kind of continue reverse engineering this process, then we want to segment your audience, because not all of your listeners are going to be at the same stage of awareness. And so if we want to get people further down the funnel, what we have to do is we have to be able to tailor that content to each segment of our audience's awareness in order to be able to move them where we want them to go, to move them to action. And so this goes back to podcast messaging, which is pillar 1 of the pod launch framework, which is having that messaging in place that shifts perspective, which you mentioned, Philip, but also that doesn't overteach. You got to stop teaching how-to content. Yes, it might be good for the listens. Maybe. You can still use how-to in your titles. But ultimately, if you're actually teaching someone the technicalities of how to do something, they should be paying you for that. So we want to keep that how-to content behind a paywall. Now, I know that a lot of us have been taught, well, how-to content is the best way to give value. And the reality is it's actually the worst way to give value for the reasons I mentioned earlier, because it either makes someone feel too overwhelmed to want to take the next step, or it makes them feel like they have everything that they need. The reality is they don't have everything they need. They still need you, but they don't believe that they need you. And that's the key. So what you want to be doing in your episodes is tailoring your content to each segment of your audience and teaching them what they need to do and why it's important, and overcoming the beliefs, helping them overcome the beliefs and the limiting perspectives or the limiting mindsets that have kept them from seeing the new way that they need to be doing things. And then from there, this gets us to the calls to actions in the episodes themselves. You want to be integrating clear calls to actions in every single episode to guide your listeners to taking that action towards your product, towards your service, to get on your email list, whatever that next step is. This is a piece that we are actively optimizing for right now. I admittedly have not done the best job of this. We've got the links in the show notes, but you can't just put links in the show notes and expect people to take action. And the reason why is because of the listener-host relationship. It's the relationship with you that's going to get the listener to take action in the first place. So you got to point them to the links, and you got to do it over and over, because not every listener hears every episode. And you're going to have new listeners coming in, and they're not going to hear the stuff that you've said before. So while it might feel a little repetitive to you, or you're like, oh my gosh, I don't feel like I need to say this call to action again, you do, because you're going to have a new listener. You're going to have another listener who maybe didn't hear the other episode where you said it. And so you want to always be pointing them where they need to go. One more thing that I will add when it comes to giving calls to actions on your podcast is to keep it light. You're not selling them on anything. You're not here to twist their arm or to convince them or to say, oh my gosh, you don't want any of that like desperate energy to come through your voice, because it will. And this is something I have struggled with in the past, where I'm like, yeah, if you want to book a call with us, book a call. Back in the early days of my podcast, like, if you want to come to my workshop, I guess you can. There's the link, and it was like, oh my gosh, girl, like, get over yourself. Like, you were inviting these people to learn more for something that they want to do. They're here because they want to be here. You got to remember that. This is like, think of your podcast like you're throwing a party for people, and it's all of your best friends and the people, you are the most popular person in the room. The listeners have the relationship with you. They want to be in the room. They want to be there. So now it's just the next step. Instead of being like, hey, you want to come over to my house for a party? Now it's like, oh, you're here at my house for the party. You want to take the tour? You want to go see the cool workout room that I have in the back, or come check out the pool, or, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe this butler's pantry. Come check it out. And so it's just inviting them to take the next step. And so your energy is going to come through with that. We got a lot of episodes here on the show that talk about the power of your voice. And this is so true when giving those calls to actions. So again, when it comes to conversions, you got to have the podcast messaging, the positioning, and the growth piece dialed in. And then we want to make sure that we're building the funnel around the podcast, where the podcast is a function of that funnel, and that we know exactly where we're leading people. And to do that, we got to reverse engineer the process. So I'm willing to bet that you probably have some of these pieces in place already. So now it's just a matter of mapping out what you're ultimately looking for on the conversion side, and to start optimizing for that without taking your foot off the gas on the growth side. Keep doing what's working there. We ultimately want to optimize for both types of traffic so that now the podcast funnel as a whole can function and it can flow. So Philip, I hope this was helpful for you as far as pointing you in the direction that you need to go. I know we've just scratched the surface here, but if you're listening and if you've got any questions about your podcast or about turning your podcast into the number one source of leads for your business, then you're going to love this new feature that we just rolled out here on the show. You can go to the show notes now, and there's a link there that you can click to text me your question. I love getting questions from listeners like you because it helps me create the exact kind of content that I know you want to hear. And I always appreciate it when listeners like you take the time to ask me a question because I am here to help and I want to help. And if you want help to build your marketing funnel around your podcast so that you can convert more listeners to leads, but also turn your podcast into a viable stream of revenue for your business, an actual stream of revenue, then below that text me a question link, you're going to find the link to book a call with our team. And let's chat and let's find out if you're a fit for pod launch. And then stay right where you are because in the next episode, we are diving into a little known strategy for crushing every podcast goal that you set. I've got multiple time best-selling author Hal Elrod joining me so that you can learn how to set podcast goals that you can actually hit and keep your competitive edge in an increasingly crowded podcast landscape. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.